Hello, and thank you for joining us today for NDA Group's webinar hosted alongside PharmaFocus. Let me introduce today's speakers. I'm Louis Goss, a journalist and member of the editorial team at the monthly newspaper PharmaFocus and its sister website, pharmafile.com. Today, we are joined by Lisa Peluso, Director of Coaching and Client Engagement at PharmaProve, a member of the NDA Group. PharmaProve is the leading strategic, regulatory, and scientific communications consultancy in the pharmaceutical and biotech industries in the US, Canada, and Europe. They have successfully prepared hundreds of teams for high-stakes interactions with regulatory bodies, payers, and assessors, including oral explanations, advisory committees, HTA and payer meetings, and pre-NDA BLA meetings. Today, we are focusing on the FDA Advisory Committee meeting, and in particular, the patient voice during the open public hearing. Lisa will cover quick guide to FDA advisory committees, the open public hearing and what it means, registering, preparing, delivering, tips on making sure your voice is heard. Just a few housekeeping points before we begin. You are able to submit questions at any point during the webinar, and we will try our best to answer as many as possible during the question and answer session at the end. If your question is not answered in the running time, we will send out a survey afterwards, where you can note any comments or questions that you may have. The webinar will be made available for download shortly after the session is finished. I'd now like to hand over to Lisa Peluso so that she can share her expertise with you.
Thank you, Louis, and welcome everyone. Well, why are we all here today? Here's the reason why: patients. They are why we all do what we do, and you see here a group of sickle cell patients and advocates standing in front of FDA in Silver Spring, Maryland. And they are the most important voices of all when it comes to treatments, particularly for underserved populations and patients with rare diseases. FDA wants to hear them, and the public needs to hear them. And we're going to talk today about the open public hearing portion of FDA Advisory Committee meetings as an opportunity to be heard. So as Louis just mentioned, here's what I'm going to cover today. I just want to make sure we all have a fundamental understanding of what I mean by advisory committee meetings, so we'll have just a quick refresher. Then we'll focus on the OPH, or open public hearing, which is a portion of that advisory committee meeting. I'll cover the basics of how to register to speak and prepare, and I've tried to weave in some tips based on experience of over 45 advisory committee meetings in preparing and delivering. First, just a little reminder of advisory committee meetings themselves. At its most basic, an advisory committee is an independent committee of experts brought together by the FDA to get advice on a range of scientific or technical or even policy issues. What's most relevant to our discussion today is the purpose of getting real-world input from predominantly clinical experts about new drugs or devices. And there are about 50 advisory committees divided into drug, device, biologics, and therapeutic areas, and even more specific subcategories. You can learn more about them by visiting the link that's on the slide here, or also on the right in the resources. When you go in there, you can read about how to register, the purpose of them, and there is also guidance in there for behavior at an advisory committee, as well as speaking and preparing to be at an open public hearing. So FDA might ask an advisory committee to convene around an emerging safety issue of a class of drugs, or to get advice on clinical development program, or even to discuss what strains of flu to include in the next year's vaccine. But again, for our purposes, we're going to focus on an advisory committee that would be called to assess the safety, efficacy, and benefit risk of a product that is under review by FDA. And these meetings are almost always open, meaning they're public. They're day-long meetings for the most part. Some of the reasons that FDA calls these meetings are listed here. As a top line, it's generally because the agency feels they need additional input to make a final decision on an application. This is not inclusive, but an application may be a new molecular entity. The development program may have used novel clinical or surrogate endpoints that need to be explored by experts. There could be significant issues around the efficacy and or the safety of the product. And then the last point here, there may be public health questions or significant interest to the community that the FDA would like to have aired not only with this committee but with the public. And so these are all some of the reasons that a meeting might be held. These committees of experts are tasked with reviewing a lot of data and materials, but they don't review the full application. That's the FDA's job. So here are the responsibilities for a committee during any given meeting. First of all, prior to the meeting, they will read the FDA and the applicant briefing materials, which are provided about 3 to 4 weeks in advance to them, as well as any public statements submitted through the docket online. So they have a lot to do even before the meeting starts. At the meeting itself, they will listen to the applicant present to an FDA presentation, as well as any speakers during the open public hearing. The committee will ask questions of the applicant and of the FDA, and then discuss questions FDA has posed to them, and possibly even vote to advise on a path forward. It's important to remember that this is just a recommendation and not a final ruling. The FDA, of course, makes the decision about any product. So this is what a meeting might look like to discuss a new therapy under review. It opens with a call to order and some FDA remarks setting the stage for the day, followed by a presentation by the applicant, which is between an hour and an hour and a half usually. Then the committee has an opportunity to ask questions of the applicant presenters. There may be a break, at which point the FDA then presents their top-line findings in review of the submission. The committee can ask questions then of FDA, although oftentimes they'll ask of the sponsor there. There's a lunch break, at which point the open public hearing begins. It's highlighted here in blue. And it's important to remember that an advisory committee is an FDA meeting. This is something where they're in charge, and the applicant is merely invited to present and defend their data and development program. Therefore, the open public hearing is an unusual window for public participation, and we'll go into more detail in a second. After the open public hearing, there may be more questions from the committee to the applicant or to FDA, and they will talk about the discussion questions FDA has given them and may even vote before adjournment at the end of the day. Now, what is this open public hearing? Well, it's mandated for every meeting if it's a public meeting, and it's usually 30 minutes minimum up to an hour for a full day meeting. And it's a time for any interested person to express their views. In order to speak, you have to register in advance, and the deadline for registering is generally about 2 weeks prior to the meeting itself. Know that the FDA really does understand the importance of the open public hearing, and they encourage participation, especially from patients. But why is it so important? Often, it's an opportunity to educate the committee, particularly for rare diseases. Though advisory committees are made up of experts, they don't necessarily treat the condition being discussed. And as an example, before the Cardiorenal Drugs Advisory Committee, a neurogenic orthostatic hypotension treatment was being discussed. And the committee was not made up of neurologists, it was made up of cardiologists. So they had little or no experience with this disorder. And at that meeting, the open public hearing speakers were really important. Secondly, it is a critical way to supplement data. The data never speaks for itself, and when benefit may be considered modest or the benefit risk advantage minimal, patients and others can share experiences that may more adequately reflect that benefit, as well as the level of risk that patients are willing to accept. And finally, it's a chance for the public to inform the agency about the realities of treating and living with certain disorders, and how these regulatory decisions are impacting their lives, or if they're doctors, their clinical practice. Some patients may have no treatment options, and some may need others or better options, especially when current treatments are entirely subpar. And sickle cell is a recent good example of that. What should an open public hearing not be? And I feel pretty strongly about this. First of all, it should not be ignored or underestimated by the sponsor. It can change votes. There could be negative voices there. It's something that you should think about what's the best way to inform your stakeholders about it. It should not be manipulative. You should not be parading a groomed group of speakers in front of the committee. It is definitely not a time to take pot shots at the agency or at industry itself. And finally, it really needs to be honest. Speakers should disclose their relationship with the sponsor or with any of the competitors in a very transparent manner. Patient voices, as I mentioned, are critical for rare disorders. They translate science to reality. To quote the ex-FDA patient liaison, James Valentine, quote, "It's one thing to understand or read something, but another thing entirely to hear it directly from a patient," end quote. Next, patients' voices bring the committee's head out of the data into what it means to the individuals being treated. Patients' unique experiences and perspectives can really help these clinicians understand how much weight to give, for example, to a surrogate endpoint or a quality of life result that may not really adequately capture some of the outcomes that are most important to these patients. And nobody can tell their story like they can. Leading advocates in the U.S. understand that even doctors who treat these patients need to hear from them. They will admit that every time they do, they learn something new. So how should we really think about the OPH with all this in mind? It's ideally a platform for the public to bring meaningful and real-life perspectives to this scientific meeting. For applicants and other stakeholders, such as advocacy groups who may be receiving funding from sponsors, there are three important things to remember. One is to make sure that speakers use their own words and speak in their own voices. Second is to help them and empower them, but do not groom the speakers. And third is to support the logistics and the planning and prep and make sure that it's disclosed transparently. The committee and the FDA and the press all expect this. Now, I mentioned support and empowerment because an advisory committee meeting is not a walk in the park. It's actually a very daunting experience for anyone. This is why sponsor teams spend months preparing their teams to present and defend their products. This is a public meeting. There are cameras all around the room. It's usually being webcast live, and every word is transcribed and will live on FDA's website forever. And yet, despite these pressures, a lot of brave people will step up to the microphone and speak during the open public hearing. Let's take a look at some of the types of speakers you might see at an OPH. I've kind of bucketed them out on the left by types that we see a lot, and I've highlighted, of course, at the top, the patients, the most important here. Commonly seen are people like healthcare providers who are specialists or maybe investigators, organizations, and advisory advocacy groups as well. Now, second from the bottom, it's also important to note that you may see negative voices there. There are two groups I've listed here that show up for the open public hearing of most advisory committees, although I've never seen them speak positively about a treatment. So it's important to keep this in mind as you're thinking about this part of the day as well. So how do you sign up to speak? Well, I have links here, which you will find in the resources tab on your right. And this meeting is announced in the Federal Register as well as on FDA's website, so you can see it on either place. The challenge, though, is that it's very long. It's not written or laid out very clearly, so it can sometimes be a bit difficult to decipher how you're supposed to go about registering or making public comment for these. But in a nutshell, what happens is speakers must request to speak in advance, and there will be a contact name where you send your name and address, how much time you would like to speak, and they ask for a general nature of your talk. At this point, you could mention that you were in the clinical trial, for example, and you would like to talk about your experience on this product. It's also important to remember that you will be expected to disclose any final financial relationship you have with the applicant or competitors or others. So as you request to speak, that also might be a good time to mention that to the liaison at FDA. Once you've registered, what happens next? Well, the FDA will sometimes respond to your email requesting to speak right away, but more often than not, they will wait until the deadline to register, at which time they will email everyone saying that you have been accepted, and they'll let you know how much time you have, give you instructions on where to go and sign in, and how to provide any materials you might want to use, like slides, for example. At that point, the speakers, you should start planning your travel, prepare for any needs you'll need there or accessibility, and you'll need to coordinate with FDA directly on that. And then, of course, prepare your presentation and any slides or video or materials that you want to bring with you. FDA does encourage you to do so, and you are even allowed to provide printed materials for the committee to have to supplement your presentation if you like. So how do we help patients and their families share their voices? Well, there are a myriad of considerations, particularly for elderly or handicapped individuals who can't travel easily. And there are a lot of patients who've never spoken publicly before. So we begin by providing information on the meeting itself, what's involved, how to request to speak. Do a lot of listening and answering questions and allaying fears, because it is quite a nerve-wracking endeavor. We will educate on how to prepare, give tips on that, arrange travel, lodging, meals, and then, of course, also provide support in the DC area, encouraging some practice, calming nerves, and, of course, handling any last-minute needs. And these could be details all the way from a refrigerator in a hotel room for medication to making sure that there are seats available at the venue closest to the restroom. Arriving at the FDA and signing in at the meeting is also something we kind of prepare folks for. There's a table outside the meeting room. You see a photo of one here. And as a speaker, you would go up, identify yourself as registered to speak at the open public hearing, and sign in. At that point, you will receive a little badge with a number on it to pin to your clothing, and that's the number in which you will speak. At this table, you'll also find all the slides and the agenda for the day and questions, so you can collect those materials and then go into the meeting room itself to locate the seating that is reserved for the open public hearing speakers. Now, this is a big room. This is actually FDA's White Oak meeting room, and everyone should be familiar with this before they go in and the layout, so they're comfortable. They can kind of see where the cameras are. They'll understand where the seats are likely to be, as well as where the podium is in that room. And I always encourage the speakers to get really comfortable with the room and that podium itself. There's a microphone there. There is a timer at the podium, which will change from green to yellow as the speaker's time is running down, and then it will change to red for the last few seconds, at which point the microphone will be cut off. And this is why we always encourage any speaker to practice and prepare for this time limit during their talk. Most patient speakers are understandably nervous and really grateful for encouragement. They are sharing deeply personal and often emotional stories. And the open public hearing may follow some negative FDA presentations or some contentious Q&A. So being there in the moment can also be pretty nerve-wracking. Though it's extremely unlikely, the committee is actually allowed to ask questions of anyone speaking at the open public hearing. I've never seen this done in the 15 years or so that I've been doing this. but just the knowledge of that can make somebody a little bit nervous. So how does this work when you're in there and you get called? Well, your number will be called. Speaker number 1, please come to the podium. You will go to the podium, adjust the microphone, and of course, take a deep breath, as we all should do before we present. Identify yourself, and of course, remember to disclose any financial relationship you have with a sponsor or competitors. Speak slowly and clearly. This is critical to being heard. And of course, finish before that microphone gets cut off at the end of your time. These are the basics for any speaker, but for patients and others who are unaccustomed to presenting and making formal statements to the public, it's really important to help them gain some confidence. This is Juanita. She's a 20-year-old sickle cell disease patient who spoke eloquently at an open public hearing. As I mentioned before, patients and caregivers should never be groomed, and their words must be their own, but I encourage everyone to work hard at structuring their talk for a naive audience. Practice out loud and help patients to become confident in their delivery at this very public setting. Remind them to time it, of course, and then give some tips on calming nerves and commanding the podium, even just those deep breaths. Are you loud enough? Are you speaking up? Are you mumbling? And then, of course, encourage patients to revise their talk if they're stumbling over a phrase, or if it sounded like it was written to be read and not to be spoken to an audience. And they can refine it and shorten it to fit in the time as needed. So I'd like to give a couple of quick examples where the open public hearing was quite impactful. The first is Vimizim for Mercio A. Mercio A is an ultra-rare storage disease that results in skeletal dysplasia and joint abnormalities and really limited mobility and endurance. There were no approved therapies, I should say, at the time, and Vimizim was an enzyme replacement therapy that went before the Endocrinologic and Metabolic Drugs Advisory Committee. And there were a number of issues that they were asked to discuss or that FDA brought to this committee, including the clinical relevance of the 6-minute walk test, which is, of course, quite challenging for people with limited mobility. A short clinical trial, a secondary endpoint where they saw no response, that was a 3-minute stair climb test, and of course, safety concerns about these injections. What we saw at the open public hearing were patient speakers who told their stories and really reinforced the unmet need, the fact that they had nothing. They shared really meaningful efficacy results of their own pulmonary function, their growth, and their quality of life that were not captured in the data shared by the applicant. And they reminded the committee that these risks and these AEs for them are very manageable, and this had a positive benefit-risk ratio for them. The result was a positive vote of 19-1 for benefit-risk. And during after the vote was taken and the committee was asked to talk about why they voted the way they did, 7 of the members referenced the patient stories in the open public hearing. So we know that it was impactful and important for this day, and the product was approved afterwards. As a second example, was a recent pediatric advisory committee on developing therapies for achondroplasia, which is the leading cause of dwarfism. This is Aiden, and at this meeting, a number of children and families, as well as adult patients, spoke compellingly about the need to start treatment early and what outcomes were important to them, particularly as it pertained to being able to function and participate fully in a world designed for people of average height. At the end of the open public hearing, in an unusually warm and lovely manner, the chair had this to say about the speakers.
That you told your stories, and it's very important that the FDA and the committee hear those. Such amazing stories, very heartfelt, very passionate, very thoughtful. I think that everybody gets an A for composition, public speaking, and poise, and our younger speakers get an A+.
So then, what does supporting patients for the open public hearing mean to applicants? Well, it's an opportunity to know the patients and to understand the community better. It's also a chance to sustain and deepen ties with clinical trial investigators and patients, key opinion leaders, and advocacy groups to share information and data and to listen critically. Companies can be the bridge from patients to the FDA. And of course, adhering to their internal policies, companies should plan for outreach with all appropriate stakeholders as a way to foster scientific exchange and help them be heard by the FDA. Here's an email from a client regulatory lead. And as this reflects, when you encourage public participation, the speakers, especially the patients, can impact the dynamics and tone of a meeting and even the vote. And this is something that a sponsor is appreciative of. And for the patients, being a part of an advisory committee meeting, open public hearing, means they may be introduced to new information, new support groups, and really new sources of empowerment. It's a unique chance to share their voice and their story. And for rare diseases or for patients who were previously not very active in community, it's a positive and illuminating experience with a wider community. And finally, for nearly everyone, it's a chance to stretch, to gain new skills and knowledge that you can pass on to others in your network and share. We received this email, just a note to check in long after an advisory committee had passed, as this patient expressed nearly 8 months after being supported to speak at an open public hearing. The gratitude is really sustained, and this is the type of benefit and meaning for patients that is kind of unknown and untangible, to just be supported by people, to be heard. And finally, this patient, Rick, was particularly bolstered by the experience of speaking at an advisory committee meeting. Rick was a neurogenic orthostatic hypotension patient, also known as NOH, and he was extremely eager to share his story after being really alone and being felt unheard for many, many years. And after the meeting, he wrote this to us. Rick had never seen or spoken to anybody with NOH prior to being asked by his investigator if he'd be interested in telling his story at the open public hearing. Rick went on to say that since that meeting, quote, "I'm standing taller, prouder, and more confident." And this was really impactful to us when we received this after the hearing. Sadly, Rick died last year, but his voice lives on in the sharing of his story. So as you think of why we were here today, think of Juanita, the children who speak at the pediatric committee, Rick, and the countless other patients. They have a profound effect on these meetings, and speaking at the open public hearing can have a profound effect on their lives. We know the open public hearing is a vital part of our regulatory process here in the U.S. Patients need to come to the meetings, and we are thankful for everyone who's brave enough to step up to the microphone and be heard. With that, I am happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Lisa, for an extremely interesting and informative presentation. This is now your opportunity to ask any questions that may have arisen during the course of the webinar. So we'll start with, when is the deadline to register to speak at an advisory committee meeting?
Well, the deadline is usually about 2 weeks before the meeting itself. However, we have seen speakers show up at the morning of the meeting, and it's at the discretion, according to the guidance, the discretion of the chair of the committee to whether or not you would be allowed to speak. So I would encourage people, if they miss the deadline, the official deadline to still send in an email. And if worse comes to worse, go ahead to the meeting itself. It's an open meeting. You can walk in and you can ask at the registration desk if you might be allowed to speak during the open public hearing. Because I think what's important to remember, and FDA stresses this, is they really understand that they need to hear from the public at these meetings.
Excellent. So our second question, can I speak remotely if I'm unable to travel because of my condition or other circumstances?
That's a great question. And actually, we've seen a sea change in FDA's willingness to be a little bit more flexible around this. I think with the advent of the patient engagement deepening, they understand that a lot of people can't travel. And so there are a couple of options. One is recently we had somebody at a meeting speak by telephone, which was a first. I'd never seen that happen before, but in the middle of the open public hearing, somebody did call in. We've also seen people provide video testimony, which has been shown at the meeting. And in that case, it's usually required that somebody else stand in their stead as the number is called and the video is played. So you may need a proxy there for you at the meeting. And the third option that we've seen around kind of remote participation is we've had patients who've been too ill to travel in the end, but have written out their statements and had somebody go to the meeting and read it on their behalf. So I want to make sure, because oftentimes it's these people who are so ill that really need to be heard, that you work with FDA, with the liaison, to figure out a creative way that you can still be there at that meeting.
All right, interesting. A third question, I guess it leads on, is, am I able to write to the docket in order to speak as well?
So there, on the a public docket is opened when this meeting is announced, and on that docket you can make a comment. You can also you can do a private comment to the committee, which you have to send in and mark it private. But you can certainly submit a written statement on that docket online as well as go speak. That's absolutely fine. And in fact, I would say that's, as a communications expert, that's advisable, because certainly if you're getting your message included in the binder that is given to the advisory committee prior, as well as speaking it to them in person, you've got a much stronger message being delivered there.
So what are the guidelines in how much a sponsor can help? And the example given is pay for travel to enable parties to attend, for example.
So there really are guidelines around this for industry and the public. The critical thing is that it be disclosed, whatever the sponsor has done. So now it's very common that sponsors will pay for travel. I think the FDA, as well as the advisory committees themselves, understand that patients are going to have to take a day off of work. They're going to have to get childcare. They may, if they're elderly, need to have other family members take off work to help them get to DC to these meetings. So they're already giving up quite a bit. There's an enormous effort being made here, and it's quite appropriate for the sponsor to pay for their travel and their hotel while they're there. It's not appropriate to pay for anyone's time. And oftentimes we're asked about investigators or KOLs, can we pay them for their time? And I would say no. But I'd say supporting people to be there is right. It's the right thing to do. And it's just the responsibility of the patient when they stand up to say, the sponsor supported my travel so I could be here today to tell my story. And I think as long as you're transparent there, it's absolutely fine.
Excellent. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for. So thank you again, Lisa. The webinar will be available to view and download from pharmafile.com on demand shortly, along with a survey where you can submit any comments or questions that you may have. So thanks again, Lisa, and that's it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.